So the first part of the financial life design is asking myself the question, how might I allow my assets to support the life that I want to live, not the life that I should be living? Which meant that I went back to my advisor, whoever was managing my money, and I said, you have to almost not think of me as a 38-year-old woman. You have to think of me as a retired person. And it was very hard for them to swallow because the business and the industry is very top-down, models-driven. But I was very fortunate to have very listening and empathic human beings. And over multiple iterations over a 2-year time frame, I made them reframe what money should do for you in the short term. I said, forget about the 70-year, what I'm doing after 70 years. The immediate burning need of the moment is, your job is to make sure that this portfolio is actually working for now, not for the future.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Nirupa Umapathy is an investor, a writer, and a social entrepreneur who facilitates communities and conversations around change and disruption with a heart. Nirupa believes personal transformation is an intentional act, and through her Salons For Life community, she brings financial and personal wisdom into a shared problem-solving space. In this conversation, we discuss her leaving India, her home, at a young age to go study at an American college, where she studied Anthropology and Economics. Her time as a Wall Street trader, what she loved and what she hated about the job. Her period of self-searching and financial hacking to provide herself with the freedom she required to self-explore. And how today she brings what she learned to new audiences through her Salons For Life and her writing. Financial liberation is a topic that occupies me personally, and many of the people I know. So it was quite interesting to hear about Nirupa's approach and her experience. I think many of my listeners will find it equally interesting. So let's jump right in with Nirupa Umapathy. All right, I'm sitting here across the screen from Nirupa Umapathy. Nirupa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me here, Aaron. What a pleasure.
And so I always these days start with the obvious question of how are things these days for you and what's it like where you are, and give us some color on that.
I live in Jersey City and I'm right now currently in my apartment, which is also my bedroom and my home office. And it's a fine day here, actually. And like the weather outside, which is going into spring, I'm also transitioning into my own spring post-COVID, which means that I'm okay. I feel fortunate to have survived last year. So you're catching me at a time of actually deep gratitude and abundance because I'm getting ready to go home. And I'm also just winding down a very intense but rewarding corporate project. So all in all, adjusted for how much suffering I think the world has gone through, I feel like I was in a little bit of a protective bubble for the last year, for which I'm very grateful.
That's great. That's great. And you're flying in a few days. Do you want to tell us where you're going?
I'm flying back home to go to India. My parents live in the south of India in a town called Chennai. So I'm taking a long oceanic flight from Newark, New Jersey to Delhi.
Nice. How many hours is that?
15 hours.
Wow. Okay. I've done 15 hours. It's survivable.
Israel is I've actually flown to Israel as well. And it's a pleasant enough journey if you've set your mind to it.
Yeah. I flew, I think the longest flight was California straight to Tel Aviv. And that's 15 hours.
How long is that?
15. And that's serious. That's long. But it's doable if you sleep. And so how long has it been since you've been to India?
Not very long ago. I actually came back on a flight on Jan 26th last year. So I feel like I've seen my parents fairly recently. But you know how time can be very relative at this period of isolation, and it feels longer than it should.
For sure. When I lived in New York, I used to come once a year to visit. And every year, my parents would be 1 year older. And at some point, I started thinking, how many visits do I have left? And when you think about it in terms of visits, right? It's 10 visits, 15 visits. How many visits? It becomes really very real. And then I came back to live in Israel, and it all changed. I see them all the time, and I get tired of them, and I'm like, whatever. But I did go back, now that I'm vaccinated and they're vaccinated, I did go back to their home, which I haven't been to for a year, because we always met in parks and somewhere along the way. And that was a pleasure, because I love my hometown. It's very green and beautiful. So it was nice.
Yeah, I think I would probably feel the same way. I live very far away, obviously, now. And every year that passes, it gets much more precious, as you just said. But it's ironic when I'm sure I'll be there for a month. I'm going to be with them for nearly a month. And I'm sure we'll drive each other crazy after the first week.
Yep.
That's the beauty of human relationships.
That's the goal of having parents, I think, is to drive you crazy. That's great. So I'd like to start this conversation with kind of a look back. And you're going back home, so it's a good time to do that. And I wanted to ask, what's something you've believed since childhood that still drives you and is still with you today?
Oh, what a great question. I grew up, India is a very competitive society, and competitive for perhaps the lack of any better reason, the fact that it is a country of 1 billion plus people. So it can be a very competitive game for survival. So growing up, I grew up with a very strict sense of success and what being a good student would be, what being a good daughter would be, what being a good productive citizen of an Indian society would be. I pretty much carried that all the way through, I would say, until I was 34 or 35 when there was a first crack. So in a way, to your question, I think I inherited a very strong conditioning of goodness, what the ideal life should look like, what success looks like, what achievement looks like. And then I've spent the last how many ever years from when I was maybe 35 to 36 trying to break that muscle, if you will.
Yeah, so it's a picture of what the perfect, dutiful person does. It makes me think of the Bhagavad Gita. I don't even know if I'm saying it
Beautifully.
Okay. The duties that come from that is quite intense. And I don't know how much I've actually never been to India. I would love to go. It's one of my dream destinations. It's such a fascinating place. But maybe some of that is still in the culture.
Yeah. Beautiful way of putting it. Duty is something that I inherited very strongly. My father was a very dutiful, or is, he's alive. My father he was a dutiful parent, dutiful husband, dutiful employee, and my mother was a dutiful housewife. She didn't work, and we call them housewives in India. I'm just using old Indian terminology, and I wanted to very much be the dutiful daughter. And the sense of duty that was also all around us. Because remember, it's also a culture where the I is not really that pronounced. It's more community over the I. So individualism by itself can have some trouble and it can bump up against some friction. So this strong sense of duty, of course, I think I inherited it from my parents. But my parents were also some of the most kind and freeing people that I've been around. What I mean by that is they never dictated to me what I need to do. I think I just internalized what I was seeing from school, what I was seeing from my friends, society, like when we would go to social functions and social gatherings. And I took it very seriously that there was only one formula on what makes you that dutiful person. And I continued it until even after I emigrated and I came to America. My sister jokes, I had a conversation with her last night. She said, yeah, you are the kind of person, if in the name of duty, if someone asks you to run into a burning house, you will not think twice about it. And so it is a huge blind spot, I would say.
It's really interesting. And at the same time, clearly there's also a strong will there and a strong individualism there, because you told me at 18, you decided to leave India and go to the States. That must be, this not everybody does that.
I'm a bit mad in the sense, I don't know really if I was thinking about whether I was doing anything unconventional at that time. It was actually not an idealistic burst for freedom, but it was actually a very urgent sense to want to leave at that time, because to your point, I was always someone that had that colored outside the lines. And I always marched to the beat of my own drum. But I was also very much wanting to be a good student and a good daughter. And I couldn't resolve that conflict. And which is why I left. I left because I concluded that India of that time, and of course things will be very different now, was not going to be supportive of a young and tempestuous woman that I was then. And for me, America was, it promised not greener pastures, but freer pastures where I could roam around and eat any colored grass that I wanted to.
Yeah, interesting. And so tell me about that transition. And so what kind of triggered it? And what was it like to land in a new country at 18? That's pretty intense. I left at 24, and I think I was maybe a little bit more formed. I had a few years. I had 5 years of my first job already. So
Yeah, I was quite half-baked
yeah.
when I landed here in Newark, actually. Actually, there were one very beautiful reason why I left as well, which was a huge motivation. I was in love and dating someone, and I was very young to have been dating someone in India at that time, at least in Madras, which is where I was born. And he came overseas to go to college. So that was the motivation of the heart. But that was not entirely, that was the catalyst that kind of really pushed me over the hump to go. But the real reason was this burning desire to pursue a very serious liberal arts education, even though I didn't know the word liberal arts back then. I knew that I was very multidisciplinary, and in India, I did 2 years of college, and there was a way where they slotted you into that you have to study this, and then when you graduate, you're going to do this, right? And I didn't enjoy that. And the third reason, and I'm going to make a point which it's a point of vulnerability, and I'll say it for this audience. And I want to make a giant caveat that I'm speaking of a time that was very peculiar at a point in time in Indian history and where I lived. So I don't want to make any generalizations. But I grew up in a lower middle class to middle class family at that point in time. And so something as mundane as going to college meant that I had to take public transport. And at that time, sexual harassment on buses and how you were treated as a woman, like manifested in very obvious and unpleasant ways. And so for the 2 years that I went to college there, going to college and coming back from college became such a harrowing experience for me that it, for me at that time, seemed like a huge indignity and a violation of my human self. I didn't know this that strongly at that time because this happened. It was extensive in where I was, perhaps. And it was a class thing as well. I'm not saying that people that were chauffeured around or if you had the privilege of being protected from it, perhaps you escaped it. But that was probably 60% of the reason, if you ask me, like that anger, the burning anger to want to leave. And then this very free-spirited side of me which said that I don't want to be a one-box model. I want to play in multiple boxes, combined with having found young love and wanting to pursue it is what brought me here.
Nice.
So that's a bit of a long-winded response to your question. But when I landed here, I think that I was quite fearless. I showed up with one suitcase and I went to an incredible liberal arts institution called Smith College, which is an all-women's school. Yep, I almost got a full financial ride, which means that I couldn't have afforded it otherwise. If I didn't get the kind of financial aid from Smith, I wouldn't have come here in the first place. But I landed here and I think I was so ready to escape that homesickness did not hit me until 7 years later when I started work.
Interesting. And these are all good reasons to go and explore. And the issue of sexual harassment in India is still in the news. Like I still hear stories about this today. And it sounds like today things are maybe people are beginning to rise up against it.
There was also a law that was, by the way, the behavior that I just described to you was called eve teasing in India, in Madras. Actually, I don't know what it was called everywhere else. We had a very famous Indian female chief minister, Tamil Nadu chief minister, the state that I grew up in. And when she came to power, she put in very strict laws on overturning this. And actually that behavior is very substantially come down. I'm not saying that acts of violence don't happen against women. And we read plenty of stories. But that particular phenomenon, I think, is much more muted, at least where I am from. So, and sexual harassment, Iran, it's everywhere. The question is, do you have the courage and do you feel, is there the safety to talk about it? And is there a community to support you around it?
Yeah. I once wrote, I don't know if this is true in any absolute sense, but this is my impression, is that in New York, for instance, there's so much individualism and distance between people that it actually can make women feel unsafe because they're not sure if another person would step in to help them. And so there's sexual harassment cases in New York too, in the subway, and it has to get really out of hand before someone steps in.
Yeah.
And in Israel, there's a much more activist mindset. My sense is it's enough that someone in a bus station would just say something not nice to a woman, and other men around would be like, shut up, go away, and would step in. And I think that makes for a safer atmosphere, and a flirtier, more fun atmosphere because people feel safer. So
Yeah.
I used to get fear reactions from women where I would look at, if there's eye contact by accident in the street, like they would lock down. And that doesn't happen here. It's a much more relaxed atmosphere. And I think it's because of a more activist mindset of, I don't want to live in a neighborhood where this happens. So if I see it, I'm going to do something about it.
I don't disagree with you at all. As it concerns living here in America, and it's a very independent culture, to your point. I live right across New York City, and I've traveled pretty extensively for business and as also personally. And the thing that I will worry about in America is, and whether I think you're a man or a woman, or depending, whatever your pronoun is, if I were hit by a bus, I would worry about, would someone come? And would someone, that's something that I worry about in America a lot in terms of this kind of individuality and this sometimes insularity. In India, it's interesting because the context is so complex, because the same behavior that you're talking about is very pronounced in India as well. There are situations where I've seen the mob completely take over and someone comes to the defense of someone that is being assaulted. You know what I mean? But then again, there's also equally situations where there's extreme brutality that happens, and what are the circumstances of that? Not entirely sure. Yeah.
I've learned from observations in New York that there is a border where if something really bad happens, everybody suddenly jumps in. So I've seen a situation in the subway where some guy was abusive to a woman, just a stranger in the cart, and they would yell at her and curse at her, and nobody would do anything. Would pretend that it's not even happening. Right? In Israel, someone would stop it. But then he made an attempt to slap her, and 5 people grabbed and stopped him. And I personally, I one time passed out in the subway. I was not eating that day or something, and I got out of the subway and I passed out, and I woke up with a lot of people helping me, and they called the ambulance, and I was fine after that. But that changed my perception, because when you walk around, it's almost like nobody's paying attention to anything, and drunk people are on the floor and people walk over them. But once it crosses into, okay, this is really bad, this is out of the norm, or this person seems passed out and not drunk, they seem like they may be sick or need help, then people do something about it. And at least that's my experience.
I think you're spot on, beautifully said. I think that there's a very strong sense of boundaries in this culture, and Western, at least on this side of the Western culture, and there's actually probably a lack of boundaries, and like where in India, where I come from. And New York is from the outside, where it looks intimidating and it looks disconnected, but it's actually such a complex web of all of us. It's quite quantum in that. I think that we are all fully aware of each other, but we also are able to travel in the small spaces and give ourselves space, which is fascinating. Yeah.
It can be very relaxing after some time in Israel to go back to New York, and I'm like, oh, I can do whatever I want. Nobody's paying any attention.
Nobody's going to look at you. You could be wearing like a clown suit and like sitting in the subway, and it'll be like business as usual.
Exactly. So you went into New York, or is it New York? You went into the U.S. I don't know if it's New York.
No, I flew into Newark, but I studied in Massachusetts.
That's right.
Yeah. I studied for 3 years, and I went to London for a year, and I started my career in Manhattan.
Okay, that's
interesting.
So
I worked in finance. I didn't go to New York because I wanted to live like in a place that was not a shoebox. And so I moved to Jersey City in 2002, and I worked in downtown Manhattan. Okay. And I worked for 14 years in Manhattan.
Yeah. And so before we get to that, but you chose to study Anthropology and Economics, which is an interesting combination. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think my first love was anthropology, and my my ongoing love is anthropology. I think, as you probably know, I was on an H-1B visa. I'm sorry, I was actually on an F1 visa, which is a student visa. And the very pragmatic Indian side of me when I was a junior was like, how am I going to get a visa when I graduate or find a job if I just had an anthropology major? So the economics was like a backup option, which I actually took on at the end of sophomore year. And at that time, I actually did have ideas and dreams of going into development. And then I took one very fated anthropology course taught by a professor on development. And I concluded that the Western model of development was very ethnocentric. And that was probably too much of an impulsive and very quick to judge kind of conclusion. But in any case, that combined with the fact that I was going to graduate and I was here without a support network. How was I going to make money and support myself? So it became a very pragmatic decision to find a job where I could survive. And it just so happened that I got recruited into finance into Wall Street as a sophomore. And I hated Wall Street. I hated it for at least 5 to 6 years. But somehow I have this tendency to muscle my way through things that are very painful. And I did. So the anthropology and economics, now I'm actually using more of my anthropology in some ways, if you ask me. Because the study of context and the study of how we value attribute and value create, I think will remain a universal lesson. And I think it's been a nice setup to go into understanding a little bit of design thinking, even though I'm not a trained designer. But I think the design thinking and anthropology have very common values. And so I think anthropology feeds my life to this day, actually. Economics, but not so much.
Yeah, it's
science, like, it's okay.
Economics helps you understand certain systems, I think, really well from the little that I've studied that. But anthropology is like human beings and life. It's everything else.
It's universal, right?
Yeah.
Like it's almost like it could be a religion in some ways if you think about it without a god.
Exactly. And I had a history major in my undergrad, and it was, if you ask me, people might think, oh, this is completely useless because you're not going to teach history. So what is it good for? But I use the history degree every single day in reading the news, in thinking about people, in just even knowing the scope of what's possible in the world. Like society doesn't always have to be the way that it is now. It hasn't always been this way. There are all these alternatives. And for me, it was huge. And so you said you hated Wall Street for the first 5 years, but you ended up spending over 14 years in finance. And so tell me, what was that journey like?
I will say that the summer internship was very intense. But from the outside, you would not have known that I didn't enjoy it because I'm very good at faking it, I think, to a certain point. I always smiled. I always showed up early, and no one ever would have thought that I didn't enjoy it. Yep. But it was manifesting itself in the stress that I would bring to home. I started a full-time job and I worked at one of the major investment banks, and I started in what is the analyst program, and I did something called credit derivatives. Why did it take me that long to actually, and eventually, by the way, I did my relationship with the job turned, i.e. it became interesting and it became something that I really latched onto. It fed me intellectually. And it fed my analytical brain. Why did it take me 5 to 6 years? Because I think Wall Street is a very intense place, and it's quite a peculiar culture. And I didn't grow up. I come from an environment where my parents were terrified of conflict. And one of the first memories I have of being an intern on the trading floor was seeing phones being broken, and it was just a huge culture shock. And this is the language, and this is, at least at that time, this was the performative aspect of being on the trading floor. I worked on the trading floor, and buying and selling, and the hue and the cry. It's like a jungle of its own, kind of with its own stripes. And I was frankly just not prepared for it. The intensity of it, and largely some of it had to do with my own performance anxiety, because it's a culture where it is sometimes a zero-sum game, but I equally is also someone that has a very punishing sense of what I need to deliver. So combine the ambition of that industry or that context with my own personal ambition to want to get there in a hurry, which I wanted to, by the way, just to be clear. I think I made it really just difficult. I was really hard on myself. And it's ironic because, Iran, that was just like weird timing, because I started falling in love with my job in 2007, just on the eve of before when everything was going to collapse. And then I was finally like, I think I've found my footing. And then the world kind of like it went lights out for a bit. So
Yeah. The irony of life sometimes.
yeah,
I've had moments like this when I'm like, oh, I feel at home for the first time in this
it's
town.
time.
2 months later, I have to leave. Or it's interesting. And so what did you take from finance that is still with you? What did you take from that time that you want to carry with you forward?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you another example of how I had to leave finance to fall back in love with finance. I worked for a large investment bank for a majority of my career, Bank of America, and because of certain circumstances, I resigned in 2015. And at that point in time, and in retrospect, looking back on it 4 years later, I realized that I actually had burnt out. And it was not like a burnout with an explosion. It was like one of these kind of slow burning burnouts where you don't even recognize it, that you were burnt out. And then I went to a hedge fund for a year, which did not work out. And then I exited and I said, this is it. I'm done. This is not really feeding me, even though I will say that what kind of a terrific foundation was. That was a boot camp in learning to not manage, but to work with one of the most important resources, whether we like it or not, whether it's equitable or not. Money still continues to be a very vital resource. And to deal with money as an object unto itself was one of the most important lessons from finance. What I mean by that is, over 14 years, as I was a salesperson, you transact in large sums of money, like hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And at some point, you stop thinking about the fact that these are large sums of money and you just deal with it as a flow. It's something that flows between a buyer and a seller. It's transacting, and this river of money, invisible money, is flowing between computer screens, but it's a flow.
Yeah.
I got very comfortable with just being around it. Whether I'm not saying from the standpoint of being rich or poor, but I'm just saying literally just take it as an object of exchange.
Yeah.
So very anthropological, right? And think about it as also as perhaps at times it felt like a high stakes game of poker, and taking calculated bets and knowing, understanding what the trade-offs are, knowing where to bound your losses, knowing where to like let profits run. All of these were lessons that I learned from being on the trading floor and learning from the best. But the culture of it for me was so punishing that I didn't take the time to enjoy it and breathe it and live it and learn it. In 2017, I said no finance. And I gave myself a year. And for 3 years, I didn't do anything with finance in that true sense. And then I started missing something. And what I realized was I was missing the language of the markets. I was missing that I couldn't talk about a certain proficiency of the way you think about the world, the way you read the news. And it's like capital has its impact on the way companies survive or die, the way the economy runs, the way a consumer is affected. All of this is like a meta story. Finance can be a meta story of this world. And I started missing that story. So that's the first thing. And I'm in the process of reintegrating it back in my own way now. But the second thing about finance was, it gave me the courage to jump and take a free fall, because I think I always had the confidence that I knew what to do with my money, whatever I'd earned. Because listen, this was a position of great privilege, because investment banking is much reviled, and I understand why. And I think that the world believes that bankers make too much money, and people in this business, why are they making this much money? And I grew up in that world, okay? And sometimes coming from I came to this country with $1,000 from my father. So going from that to being around like millions of dollars was very jarring. But at the same time, I learned that if I had a responsibility now to reframe this relationship to money and to be able to use it as a tool for good. And I started by doing that with my own life first. I said, let me not be ashamed of what I've saved up. Let me use it as an asset to embolden myself and heal myself, actually. And the more I started doing it, people asked me, like, how are you managing to design this life of autonomy? And I realized that there was some value in sharing this story with other people, that there is a way to reframe money as an important tool.
Yeah. So before we go there, I want to take you back to around 2017 when you're still in finance. And what is that moment like where you decide to break out or to stop doing finance? What was that moment? What was that decision like? And then we can hear maybe some of the way back.
Yeah, so actually it was 2016, end of 2016. Why the departure from an investment banking setup was voluntary, meaning I resigned. I was trying to go towards a new opportunity. The last stint, the last employer was involuntary. I lost my job, okay? And that was at the end of 2016. So in a way, I had closed a door to open another door, but the door that I thought I'd open that would remain open longer actually closed on me much earlier than I thought. But because I think I had been in preparation mentally and spiritually to leave finance for about 7 years. I know it's a very precise number, but I'll tell you later why. When this happened, end of 2016, for the first time in my life, I think I just, after 2 weeks of very intense grieving, and it was a very emotional period, I concluded that someone else had made the decision for me. And I was actually released from it. I was released from duty of walking away from a good job with a very lucrative paycheck, and now suddenly it felt like I had the permission to go out and just create a blank canvas. 2017, the year after, was just honestly it was a beautiful roller coaster. There were ups and downs, of course, but largely it was a year of just as if I broke out of a cage. I'm not saying that it was all euphoria, though.
Yeah.
There are definitely some dark moments. Because in New York especially, you without a business card, you without an office address, at least at that time, when remote working was not that popular, you without what do you do to your name, you are invisible.
Yeah, it's the first question that anybody asks, and then complete shutdown, I guess, if you don't have a good answer. But I maybe am too much of a coward because I always had a good answer. So it's almost like sometimes you have to be careful not to design your life according to the answer that you want to give when people ask you that question. And today I am more flexible with that. I would throw multiple things that I do that have no connections between them, and I'm not ashamed. So I have a podcast, and I'm a designer, and I'm working on a book, and I did this master's, whatever, that has nothing to do with the other things. So interesting. You got involved right with designing your life.
The book that changed my life, I've got to be honest.
Book, yeah. So tell me about that.
Oh, this is the cosmic beauty of how this universe is also a lot of magic. I like stories, so I'm going to give you a story, which is that when I found out that I wasn't going to have a job anymore, it ironically coincided as well with, this was end of 2016. It also coincided with the last business trip that I'd booked before I knew that I wasn't going to have a job, okay? And I was supposed to meet with one of my girlfriends in California, and I was crushed when I met her for dinner because literally it felt like I felt like I had no flooring under me. And it felt like a little bit of a mini death knowing that I won't be going back to a job. And also the irony of having to do your last business meeting, even though you knew that you didn't have a job. It's just weird.
Yeah.
And my girlfriend Marnie, she held my hands very dramatically and she said, "Girlfriend, I have just a book for you. It's going to save your life." And I'm like, I'm still very cynical, very analytical, roll my eyes, blah, 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 Marnie, whatever. But there was just so much enthusiasm and infectiousness in what she said. And she said, this book is called Designing Your Life. And guess what? I'm starting a book club of one. There's 5 of us in Seattle, and maybe you can dial in from Jersey City, and we'll read a chapter every month, and we'll do the homework, the exercises, and then let's see what happens. And I'm so grateful for that moment, because it was the book that she handed, and I'm so grateful that even despite my cynicism, I suspended my disbelief. I bought the book on Kindle and I read it on the flight. I read only 3 chapters. Even in my very distraught state and being terrified of what the future held, I read the first 3 chapters. It was obvious that there was a framework and a structure for the unstructured. And I said, I literally got out of the plane, and I'm quite binary like this, which is a little unrealistic, but for me, this is how I am. I got out of the plane and I said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to free fall. In 2017, and I literally told myself, I'm going to live this book for 1 year and see what happens. And I did.
That's amazing. It's amazing. In a way, it's a lot of the message that Dave also in our interview. Yep. And by the way, this is your connection. You connected me with Kathy, and Kathy connected me with Dave, and it's all thanks to you. But what Dave said was, or a lot of the messages that he gives are really almost like anti-duty when it comes to your work, right? You don't have to tell a simple story, and you don't have to have the perfect answer, and you don't this all of this rigidness that you put on top of it, that doesn't serve you, doesn't serve anyone. And was that part of the What connected?
I think, yes, one of it was the permission to free yourself from the should be life. I think they talk a lot about that. There should be predetermined outcomes. The absolute freedom of saying that work should be something that gives you joy. Work should be something, not should be, that's not. Work is something that possibly could be reimagined as an experience, as a portfolio of experiences, not just one experience. And two, as something that revitalizes you. I couldn't imagine that first. Okay, because I worked in a job that gave me a very substantial and healthy paycheck, which then has given me this privilege to do this now. And it was one which was about validation and a certain kind of success. I had never thought about work as a creative and spiritual expression, even though in my heart I knew it, because this is what I talked with my therapist about for 7 years. I yearn to do work that is going to matter, not just for myself, but that is going to have a positive influence. It'll have a positive imprint on the rest of the world. The second thing about the book, which I frankly think is going back to that framework of empathy. Start with empathizing with yourself. Who are you as a human being at this point in time? And also giving yourself the permission to evolve and be a series of humans and just growing into yourself and never being a complete product. That was freeing. And the last thing obviously was the prototyping. Oh, and how many prototypes I did like in 2017. I just had so much fun.
Tell me about that.
And I will say, this is another funny story. I was so swept by the book in my own way, and it was magic. And my sister was also on sabbatical at that time, and both of us read this book together. Nice. And she's now a designer, actually, a design thinker. Sweet. And I cold emailed Kathy Davies. I said that your book has changed my life. And because Dave didn't respond to me, but it's fine. But like Kathy did. And Kathy said, let's set up a 30-minute phone call. And she introduced me to Donatella. So my point is this virtuous cycle of this chain reaction of events and circumstances, which brought me into the right community of change makers, a book that provided a framework. Both of these were extraordinarily emboldening of what could have otherwise been a very dark and ambiguous period.
Interesting. And I think you mentioned you went to Burning Man, and that's part of your experimentation. And tell me about other prototypes or other things.
So rapid prototypes of 2017. Learning how to travel on a constrained budget. So I gave myself a certain budget, and I said, I'm going to travel as freely and simply as possible, which means no hospitality of expensive hotels. You're not buying your way into enjoyment. You're going to really lean into the shared economy. So I traveled 180 days that year. I couch surfed. I slept in really nice bedrooms with my friends. And I remember the Negev, I actually slept on a rat-infested mattress in not a kibbutz. I forget what the one for youth. There's the other one.
I guess there's hostels,
So this one was like a kibbutz, but it's specific to youth. And I'm like just blanking right now. But in any case, so the range of hospitality, the prototype was, how can I lean into the kindness of strangers and friends? Nice. And travel. So I did that, which really was life-changing. The second thing was I did try my hand at a business partnership with a friend. That was a longer prototype. We did it for 6 months in digital storytelling, in VR and virtual reality and augmented reality. That did not work out. I learned what would it be like to live on the other side of New York City and not make any money and to really constrain your life on a budget. And so I put myself on a very strict budget of not eating out and not buying anything. And of course, I live in a very nice home, which is like an inheritance from my past in the sense of my past job. I kept that, but everywhere else I lived a bit like an urban renunciate. Like I didn't socially go out. The fourth prototype was all the different narratives and how I describe myself. And I remember talking to Kathy about this because I said, I think I've suddenly overnight become a dead person. Like people can't see me anymore now that I don't have a job. And so I redesigned this cool story that like I am on sabbatical and the whole thing around what is a sabbatical and then having a range of responses was one. I think I started looking at investing in private deals, not startups, but startup-like businesses then. And the biggest prototype of all was, how might you play and how might you create a year of no structure and not let yourself be overwhelmed by panic. As much as it might sound to everyone else like this woman is crazy because a year of play sounds amazing, but it's not so amazing for someone that is used to waking up at 5:30 and comes home and drops to bed dead at 10:30. Like having that much of empty time after having led like 14, 15-hour days was very hard.
Yeah, it also gets old. I did this for a year and a half. I took a sabbatical, and at first I was trying to write a book, and then I decided that I wasn't a writer. I wasn't a fiction writer, so I'm not going to finish this novel. And then I had still almost a year left in my sabbatical, and I did meditation, and I learned how to sail, and I walked on the beach for hours. And after a while, you go crazy. So I started actually fantasizing about going to the office and meeting people, and so it's a lot of it is about balance, right? It's
totally. If too much freedom is also like weird, and it can lead to a kind of weird kind of imbalance. By the way, you reminded me two other important prototypes. Writing, actually. I started seeding what have now become more serious writing projects. By the way, Iran, just not like you, but I'm saying, again, this very predeterministic type A personality. Oh, I'm going to write 3 books. Not even knowing what the story is before you're like, oh, I'm going to write 3 books. And so that was one. And I'm actually working on a couple of writing projects now that have taken this long to unfold. And the last one, which is a more important one for me, was this whole design thinking, this life design community. I started a series of virtual Google Meet circles around this, just like what Marnie did for our book club of one. I was so inspired by its impact on my life. I started them with friends, and that became the precursor to the salons that we do now.
Nice. And we'll get to that. I have a question, because you mentioned that during these years, the next kind of 3 years, you're doing something that you called financial life design, and giving you the task of like never having to work for money, creating kind of an ideal financial situation to support your self-discovery. Do you want to talk about that? That sounds fascinating, and I definitely have at least a couple listeners that I know would be interested in this.
Yeah, totally, I can. First off, I will make a giant disclaimer, which is I cannot forget that this is a position of extreme privilege. And for a second, I thought, is it because I just had saved up a lot more money? But then I saw my sister go through the same journey, and she was able to do it in a very modest sum. So as much as my playbook might sound a little bit unreachable in places, I actually have witnessed the journeys of others who have done it with very modest sums. So the first part of the financial life design is asking myself the question, how might I allow my assets to support the life that I want to live, not the life that I should be living? Which meant that I went back to my advisor, whoever was managing my money, and I said, you have to almost not think of me as a 38-year-old woman. You have to think of me as a retired person. And it was very hard for them to swallow because the business and the industry is very top-down, models driven. But I was very fortunate to have very listening and empathic human beings. And over multiple iterations over a 2-year time frame, I made them reframe what money should do for you in the short term. I said, forget about the 70-year, what I'm doing after 70 years. The immediate burning need of the moment is, your job is to make sure that this portfolio is actually working for now, not for the future. And I said, my part of the bargain is, I will come back to you and I'll slash and burn my life and my lifestyle by more than 50%, which means I won't be carrying any weight. You do not have to worry about that. So all I'm saying is give me a modest sum of money, which will allow me to play and recreate a new life. So that was the part of what I would say financial life redesign. I had to do it over 2 or 3 years. Which meant that my portfolio looked very different from a young person's portfolio, yours and mine, assuming that we are both in the same age group. And I said, enough of looking at some far-fetched future when I have no idea where I'm going to be. It doesn't mean that we weren't responsible about what happens to the future, but it ended up introducing a different level of fiscal discipline on both sides. My commitment to shedding the weight of a lifestyle that was unnecessary, and their commitment to being creative about retesting the assumptions of what should a portfolio do. And so this is what I call financial life redesign. I force them to basically use this particular idiosyncratic user at the center of this. And now it's a pretty popular model. I think you'll hear a lot of stories about it's called FIRE. I think financially independent, retired, something. Yep. And you can read like their stories, like Money Mustache is a great blogger. And like they all have been able to upend what have been classical assumptions of what the industry has said as to what you need to live a good life and what you need to retire.
Yeah.
And so that was part of this financial life redesign for me.
Yeah.
And the most liberating thing, honestly, Aaron, the most liberating thing was knowing that I can live on very little.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in terms of financial life design, I know a few people who are very engaged with trying to create financial freedom from very little resources in some cases. I'm also looking into something similar where I realized that the biggest amount of money that I'm wasting is like rent. Mm-hmm. And just taking money and making it into maybe buying land and then putting a house on it that's not the end all be. I'll build a house later, but just stop paying rent. It doesn't make sense. And I'm also fairly privileged because I can run a design sprint. Even if I ran it every 2 months, I'll still be fine.
It was expensive, right?
Tel Aviv is about as expensive as rent-wise as New York, and some things are more expensive. Food is some types of food, and some things are more expensive here. But it just doesn't make sense. And another thing that I refuse to do is get a mortgage. Is like that seems insane to me because I could build a house with the money that I have without paying a dollar in mortgage. It might not be in the ideal place. It might not be, but I could have a nice house that I built debt free with not a lot of money. Actually, not enough to buy a house anywhere. But if you build it, you can do it. So I'm constantly thinking about that because the system has convinced us that we have to lock ourselves into a mortgage and pay it off for 30 years or whatever and just be enslaved and then not be able to leave a job that you hate. And that's slavery. That's not freedom.
Yeah, you're solving the wrong problem.
Yeah.
How am I supporting my current life? Why I'm working to support a current lifestyle is, I think, to your point, you're solving for the wrong problem.
Yeah.
I agree with you full-heartedly.
And so
I feel the same way, but I would say that the only thing I want to add to that is that I still have a mortgage. During the financial crisis, and this is the part about active financial management, it was a very brutal time for the world. And in my household, one of us lost a job and one of us kept a job. And I had to very quickly optimize the cost of living in 2008 because we're barely making enough money to support it was not an expensive mortgage from the standpoint of anything else but the interest rate on the mortgage. But 2008 was also the time when interest rates were at all-time lows at that time. So I spent a lot of time slashing and burning fixed cost of living, which includes a mortgage, which is now this is why I'm able to afford this now. So that's finance.
Yeah.
That was the knowledge of the market and knowing what to do. But coming back to your point now, the challenge that I have for the next 2 years is how can I sustainably and joyfully live a lifestyle that costs me only like $2,000?
Nice.
And that is not here, by the way, which means I will have to make a decision on where that is. And it's going to involve some serious trade-offs. Why $2,000? Why did I come up with that? It's just that, as I said, the lighter you are with your financial weight, it's going to allow you to do so much more.
Yeah, I have a good friend who moved to Las Vegas from LA. And currently, he essentially he wakes up in the morning, he does whatever he wants because he has a few streams of income. It covers his expenses. He has his runway and he knows that he can carry on for a few years at this rate, no problem. And then every once in a while, he will do a little project or something like that. And I envy him. I love what I do, so I'm not trying to get out of it. But I love this idea of freedom, and I am inspired by it and trying to figure out how to get to a place where I wake up in the morning and I do exactly what I want to do that day without regards to I have to generate a lot more money. and or
It's
just to
so
support an
liberating.
expensive lifestyle. Yeah, no, I hear it and I believe it, and I'm not quite there yet, but I'm on my way, I think. So you mentioned that one of the things you found really resonated with you, or it felt like something, a meaningful something to do, is to teach people how to engage with money and give them that message or open up doors for them. What can you tell me about your thoughts about that? And
Yeah, so I'm not a certified financial planner, or the industry is very regulated. So I actually can't offer advice to anyone from that true sense. I'm not a registered financial advisor. But surely what I've done is shared my story with close friends and family. Not that I've wanted to talk about it, but when they ask me the question, I use it as an opportunity to actually give them an idea of the reframe. And so and the salons themselves, which I know we'll talk about later, one part of the real life curriculum is on financial literacy, and in which we engage, we actually work with certified financial planners or with a financial coach. And they essentially are able to come and talk to populations on what it takes to take stock of your life's own assets and liabilities. And I largely am doing this around with a population that is middle class to lower income. And it's a very deliberate decision to transmit what has been long a very kind of closely held esoteric language world, which is like finance and high finance, and to make it more understandable and deconstructible to someone day to day. I hope my boyfriend doesn't have any objections with me telling this on the podcast, but an example is like the kind of conversations that he and I will have on how you can be intentional and how you correct your credit score, how intentional you can be in the way you pay off your debts, and how intentional you can be in managing payment of debt, how you can create a stream of how you can, by putting a why between the way you spend money and actually having a very mindful approach towards it, you can dramatically reframe what can be a painful and boring process like budgeting into something that actually has a lot of meaning. And the last big frontier is investing. So if you look at the pyramid, the Maslow's pyramid, where we are working on the salons, we're talking about food security and shelter, and we're talking about maybe getting to the next level. I'm not necessarily dealing with populations where you're talking about a mortgage or investing, because investing should actually come at the very end. You need to take care of, are you seriously in debt? Once you're out of debt, can you then go into supporting your life? And then you go into the next step, right? These are all conversations that I bring in experts, but I also equally, where I don't have to, where these are environments where I can just unfiltered share my story, I do share my story. I largely will say that I've shown people through my own behavior change and through my own kind of playbook. I always try to see if there's a listening moment for someone else. But the biggest thing that I'm very proud of is I have reframed my own relationship to money. What I mean by that is I look at it as a sacred flow. And this is very deeply spiritual at this point. When I was thinking about money for the last like 15, 16 years, I thought about it as like a poker player. I don't play poker. I'm just using it as a metaphor. It was a game of high stakes. You want to make money. It's very mechanical. It's very analytical. For me, I come from a country where the goddess of wealth is called Lakshmi, and we celebrate and worship her.
yeah,
And in the last 4 years, I've been traveling around and I've been doing these salons. I was actually shocked by how vilified money is. There is something here in the Western mindset that has now made money almost an evil commodity. Capitalism, perhaps. I don't call it evil, but it's not human-centric. We know this. But money as such, for me, is a flow. Currency means correre. It means to. It's a flow.
yeah.
And to really radically have conversations around reframing the idea of money as being a sacred energy and flow has been one of the most profound shifts for me. And I share that with friends. We do a lot of, this is going to sound very woo-woo, but we do these abundance meditations together and things like that.
No, it's the right podcast for that. It's perfect. So I don't really know. I haven't thought of this idea of money as a sacred flow, but I do, except for maybe the world of like televangelists. But I find it appealing in some way. And some of the books that I do connect with talk about the importance of allowing you to receive as well as to give, and that connects with me, and I do see how it can make me more excited about things like budgeting and pricing and all the stuff that I've been avoiding. So I can see that it's a very interesting concept, and so that kind of leads me into your salons, because there's a couple of really interesting taglines or titles that you put on the salons. So first of all, the title is like Salons for Life, which is already a really powerful title. And then you're talking about micro retreats and you're talking about listening retreats. And I love, first of all, I love retreats, and I love the concept of retreats, but I love this idea of a listening retreat. Can you want to tell us what it's
Yeah, I
like?
would
And
love. First off, thank you for taking the time to read about the salons. The idea of a micro retreat was more a throwback to when we had salons in the living room. I really took inspiration from the French Enlightenment salons, where women led a revolution of networked intelligence, if you will, at a time when universities were not available and open to women. So the salons that we've created are actually from that playbook very specifically. They were not social spectacles where royalty showed up and like the church. This was the sort of classic shared authority kind of living room setting where you behind the safe space of closed doors, you could just show up and be yourself. That by itself is a retreat. In a space where you can unapologetically be yourself and also be in communion with everyone else who showed up for the same reason. That's one. The second was, how can you design an experience to be long enough where you feel like you've gotten something substantial out of it, where you actually have enough time to come in and decompress and leave feeling enriched? We decided that it was like we needed about 2 to 4 hours. And so the pre-pandemic salons were all in living rooms. And they would go anywhere from 3 hours sometimes to 5, 6 hours. But essentially there was a 3 hour cutoff, and then people could just linger, and then it became like this speakeasy turned into a social gathering. And the third was, it was designed specifically for the harried individual that was bouncing from one professional and or family demands and or you show up to social settings where you still are wearing your mask. You still are performing. And so in many ways, they became very healing, transformative experiences for people. And this would come from all the testimonials very loud and clear. And frankly, it surprised me because all we were doing was getting people together in a room, and we were activating it through some kind of an artistic ritual, which means there would be 30 minutes of some kind of performance or dance, music, reading, poetry, but the rest of it was co-created conversational roadmaps. Co-created, meaning literally in a salon, we would facilitate such that everyone goes around and has a chance to tell their story and be seen, be heard. And in return, reciprocally, you're seeing and hearing someone else. Yeah, and one of the founding principles for me, and I think I got this from the book, and it's probably a very peculiarly designed thinking experience, principle, that you are the expert of your lived experience. You are the expert of your experience. So we created these salons where even though an artist would kick us off, we never put the artist on a pedestal. It was never about worship. We gather as equals and we will leave as equals. And for me, there was something so fundamentally democratic in that experience and how you set it up, which is so special.
It sounds, it puts me in a different mindset, even just hearing about it. And I want to dig a little bit deeper, but I will first say that you're talking to the right person, because in my undergrad, actually focused on European Enlightenment, and I wrote a whole paper about the salons of Paris, and there was,
you must send it to me, Iran.
Oh, it's in Hebrew, and I don't know if I can even find it. It was so many years ago. But it was reading about, what was it? Julie de Lespinasse, I think was her name.
Yeah, Madame Espinasse was one of the, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking right now, but actually the founding, Lespinasse was like one of the key,
one of the big ones,
founding women.
But incredible that the whole European Enlightenment happened in those spaces, and maybe the French Revolution brewed in those living rooms, and for good and evil. And but definitely the exchanges, the minds that could exchange ideas freely is such an important thing. And I think we think of, and I'll use this to open a door with you with the description of your salon, but one of the things that the internet doesn't do very well yet is transmit wisdom. So we're very good at transmitting information. And in some cases, maybe watching TED Talks or something, you can get a little bit of wisdom from someone. But this interpersonal connections on Twitter or like Facebook or whatever, it doesn't quite transmit wisdom from one person to another. We're not making each other better on Facebook. And these salons, these spaces, I feel like actually do succeed in doing that. So tell me about, how did it come about, and where are you taking this? What's happening with it?
Yeah, totally. This was actually, I'm going to give Kathy Davies the credit for, she put it in my consciousness on the word salon. She said, why don't you start a design thinking salon? And I didn't do a design thinking salon, but what ended up happening was I researched the salons, and then I stumbled across the French Enlightenment salons. 2018 is when I started. In April 2018 is when we had our first salon in a living room. I was at that point in partnership with an individual in India who was starting a creative project in India, which is going to be on site, a retreat, an actual physical retreat. And when we both connected, and it was this incredible energy that had brought us together, we envisioned the salons as satellite outlets to cultivate for patrons, meaning to bring in patrons for the arts, because that was going to be an arts-driven offsite. I think I made the mistake of signing up for a vision which I was not fully bought into. And this is fully my responsibility, because I think I always had in my dream from 2017, that the salons were going to be vessels of revolutionizing. And revolution is small micro changes, not burning fences, but through self-education.
Not cutting off heads. Okay. No. All right.
Not cutting off heads. You know what I'm saying? Good. But the revolution as an incremental micro act that you can do in your life, a micro change, a micro turning of the wheel, which for me, and the vehicle was self-education, self-discovery, and stories and arts as being the vessels through which you will plumb into an area of self-discovery. So in many ways, the salons became like group therapy sessions, even though I don't like the word, but you see what I'm saying. But I continued doing the salons in the vein of that shared partnership until the end of 2018. And it became obvious to me that I need to take this on my own, because I had fundamentally sold my vision short. And so end of 2018, I continued doing the salons, and we did them all around living rooms. And the idea of a network worked, meaning I would find friends and the community, and we would literally go from, in some cases, I went to multiple cities, and the living room would be opened up. And that community there, the hostess, like a French salonier, would bring her community. And it was all run by women. I wanted it like as spaces created and invested by women. Of course, there were co-educational spaces, but I'm just saying largely I wanted the hostess to be a woman. And they continued. And they continue to survive and flourish. I was a solopreneur at that point, because I was doing all of it by myself with the help of the artist and the hostess. And I burnt out, naturally. It's like producing every salon is like producing an event. And I was in this very torrid one salon a month kind of schedule for a while. And in my yoga community, I met my current business partner in 2019. And at the end of 2019, I asked Sybil if she will join me. Both of us were very mission oriented, because we wanted to serve. We weren't interested in making money for ourselves as much as create a community that was a safe space for adult learning, and what I call the real life curriculum. And so Sybil and I came together end of 2019, and the 2020, we were going to incorporate the salons into a nonprofit, and the pandemic hit. So at that point in time, the biggest priority became, how do you reframe the beautiful, intimate in-person experience into something online? So we very quickly pivoted into a Zoom 90-minute online salon. I mean, it was terrifying. How do you retain the intimacy on screen after having that magical, energetic exchange of people in a living room debating and discussing and dancing and laughing? And we actually started the first 3 salons very tactically. What I mean by that, we very quickly raised money for supporting the local community. So the first 3 salons were not in the traditional salon sense. We used the format we used it to support local communities that were doing pandemic COVID relief, but we also were supporting local artists and yoga practitioners. So the first 3 salons actually ended up being more about mind-body kind of integration, and at a time of deep dislocation, right? And then we ventured back into the traditional artistic salons, and we started something called the 2020 Life Interrupted Fund, which was really to raise money for artists and cultural workers, emerging artists, independent artists, people that are not represented, that were falling through the cracks, even in government support programs for a while. And we did 4 salons in that vein. Eran, I was holding my breath because how do you, as I said, how do you create intimacy? How do you create an experiential experience in 90 minutes? But in the same magic that somehow comes together with people that show up with an intention of being there fully present. And many of the salons are very experiential because they almost always involve something somatic. I very deliberately picked artists that were going to lead the audience into something somatic, something that was going to connect the mind and the body.
That's important.
And there was going to be storytelling where the audience participated. And the 4 salons were amazingly, I think, we got similar testimonials.
Nice.
And that for me was one of the most gratifying things.
Yeah.
That you can create that kind of intimacy online, and you can on Zoom screens with 15 people sitting there and doing crazy things and then coming back in. If there's a very ritualistic, intentional aspect to it, and you have a terrific facilitator, and I think artists make such terrific facilitators and yoga practitioners and mind-body practitioners, we were able to create some level of the subliminal. But am I missing the physical salons? I am. I can't wait to get back in a living room again and have people.
Gotta miss it. It's a challenge, especially I think because people are on Zoom all day long from everything, meetings, like it's all indistinguishable. And so bringing artists, bringing like interactive aspects into it, as long as it releases whatever it is, serotonin, oxytocin, whatever, like the good chemicals, then I think it makes a big difference. And yeah, I actually, in the beginning, went on a lot of these Zooms, like community events and stuff. And then after a while, I got tired and I dropped off. And then I started, and even with my friends, I was like, I don't really feel like Zooming with you. And then after a while, finding hacks to make that work. So for instance, if I'm chatting with friends, I put the Zoom on the TV. I have to connect the computer to the TV so I have a full-size friend in my living room.
Oh.
And I sit in a kind of chair in a good distance that would be like the right one for conversation. And I usually have a little alcohol, but a little glass of whiskey or something, and dim the lights. And I feel like I'm with my friend in my living room. And on this podcast, also the size of the monitor really makes a huge difference. I just got a bigger monitor. And I can, before I would have to focus on like a person who's like on my laptop. And now these things make a difference. I feel like my brain is fooled to think that I'm sitting with someone and having a conversation, and that allows me to be more natural. And I think
I love what you just said. You've just created an expansive space digitally.
Yeah, exactly.
Architecturally, almost. You re-architected for expansiveness.
Yeah. And just to fool the brain, what's the difference between a smartphone and a laptop or a TV or VR? It's all the size of the canvas, right?
Yeah. I love that. This is it brings up 2 things for me. Cognitive fatigue is real, and I'm just coming out of a pretty intense project where I've been sitting in front of my computer for 10, 12 hours sometimes, and my eyes burn like at the end of the day. Yeah. So I actually cut out any social Zooming, I think somewhere late last year. I basically just tell people I'm not going to show up. And I'm somewhat apologetic, but I'm really not, because cognitively it was starting to take a toll. And then being on the flip side of it, I realized then we need to figure out what is an intentional cadence for the salons as well. So having 1 salon a month may not be the right thing to do right now, is what Sybil and I have concluded. And we want to go back for 2021 and figure out what is the right cadence where we can keep continuity. But, and I'm very passionate about this, by the way, Eran, we don't want to contribute to what I call digital pollution. Yeah. Even in the content that I send out, I want it to be maybe once a month. And even on Facebook, I'm sometimes afraid to post more than like once or twice on something. So the current design project right now is, how do we intentionally create community and continuity while not contributing to any kind of digital pollution or debt? I don't have an answer for that.
Have you experimented with Clubhouse?
So Donatella she invited me to Clubhouse. So I'm going
Nice.
to actually, as soon as I got the invite, I went in and I'm like, I was immediately overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Only because there's a lot of conversations and
But they don't stay. There's no recording. It's ephemeral. And
it is
so it's
ephemeral. And I
more like
love
a real
that.
event. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that I plan on going back into it and experimenting to just like this kind of free-flowing podcast setup where
Yeah.
we can just have like live conversations. That is the goal, and that is one of the things that I would like to do for March.
Nice.
Free yourself. Let the forum kind of free you.
Yeah. If you organize something like that and you're interested, I would be happy to take part of that, take part of something like
Oh,
this.
I would love to. Let's do it. Definitely.
I love the idea of a free form conversation. I also love the idea that it's the combination of audio and live is so important. There's so many times where a podcast is just too much commitment or too much.
Yeah.
And just the idea that you can tune into a really interesting conversation and you don't have to plan it. There's nothing to plan. If you don't listen to it, it will be gone. But if you're there, something unrepeatable could happen.
Yeah, I love what you just said. And in fact, it's reminding me that in 2017, one of the things that I wrote in my mind maps on what I would like to do that year was a life unscripted, a life completely off script, like even traveling without a script, learning to travel because that requires trusting. Same thing with conversation. I think to what you're saying, I think the fundamental, the sublime aspect of an unscripted conversation. And I think this is why I love your podcast. Because you give, and I think I've given you this feedback as well, to create an experience where you feel like you're reading the New York Times and like listening to an audiobook and a slow playing piece of music. And to create that level of intimacy and the slow cooked aspect of it is very much part of, I think, the unscripted.
Yeah. Or just the lack of control. I'd love to close this by asking the question that I'm playing with these days for endings, which is Alain de Botton in his TED Talk talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. And a lecture is meant to give you a little bit of information, and a sermon is trying to change your life. And so if I gave you the stage for a short sermon for this audience, if you had one message that you thought could really change someone's life if they actually accepted it, and this was your opportunity to do this, what would you say?
The biggest gift that you can give this universe and this world is the fundamental act of just being yourself. And that involves going from the place where your heart sings. And I know that I'm sounding very poetic when I say this, but we all know the distinct moments when it's your heart that is speaking and not your brain. This is the biggest commitment I think that you can make to yourself, to honor the heart. And in doing so, actually, you're doing the world a huge service. It's taken me almost 40 years to come here. I'm just starting this journey of the heart, even though I've been in preparation. And it has single-handedly been one of the most emotionally and spiritually enriching journey that I have undertaken. And it's been a journey which is involved, sometimes, as I call it, swimming the sea of no markers. But I believe, and this may come from a very Indian karmic standpoint, which is when you commit to yourself, the universe conspires with you, like Rumi would say, to make sure that all the resources show up and your community shows up. But it often requires you to walk away and be in a position of deep listening to know what your heart says. It's as simple as it sounds. It's actually quite difficult.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to take me this lifetime, maybe many lifetimes after, to figure out truly what is the song of the heart.
Yeah. I think one thing that I've always, because we always look for our passion. What's my passion? What's my passion? And Dave even talks about that in the book. And it's almost like when you stop asking that question and you stop looking for words as the answer, that's when the real answer starts to surface.
Yeah, and oftentimes it might actually, and I practice yoga and I practice Pilates, more yoga than Pilates, but if you talk to a lot of somatic practitioners, they will tell you that the body actually is in the present, and the body is very connected to the heart. And in moments where you're not entirely sure where the signal is from the noise, just listen to your body and it'll very quickly lead you to where your compass lies at that moment.
I like that.
And I think that is it really about passion? I thank God that book actually thankfully eradicated that from my head. Oh, that's one more compliment I have to give that book. I stopped looking for passion. I'm trying to look for very ephemeral moments, as you just said, of being joyful and being kind, not just to the outside world, but to yourself. And I think in the moment of being joyful and being kind, I think flow follows. And I'm still in process, Aaron, and I think that this is going to take me a lifetime to get to understand and to crack a little tip of the iceberg, if you will. But I think looking back, if you asked me what would I want written on my epitaph, I was thinking about this the other day. I think she lived a lot, she laughed a lot, and she made other people cry, or something like that. You know what I mean? I think I really am living up to that. And I just think that I wish everyone, including yourself, the boundless joy of just finding yourself and what a gift you really are and what you have to offer this world,
Thank you.
Yeah.
And it was great talking to you today.
Thank you for having me on your podcast. Thank you for doing the great work that you're doing as well.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.